Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. We're just getting ourselves settled and getting started. We'll give a few minutes here for folks to arrive. If you're just arriving, welcome. And we're just going to wait another minute to give folks a chance to get settled in, and then we will begin. Patricia, before I start, how is the PowerPoint? Are you able to see it?
I can see it, and your
Okay,
audio is good.
great. All right. Well, we can get started. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this webinar on closing the traceability due diligence gap. We're so glad you're here. This OECD side session is co-hosted by Verit and the Responsible Sourcing Network. We thank the OECD very much for this opportunity to host a presentation and a conversation around how due diligence can be integrated into traceability efforts. This webinar is again co-hosted by Verit and the Responsible Sourcing Network. My name is Erin Klett. I am a Senior Program Director for Research Innovation at Verit, and I directed the Supply Chain Tracing and Engagement Methodologies, or STREAMS project that I'm going to be speaking about today with Patricia. Patricia and I are going to talk about our experience on the intersection of traceability and labor due diligence as part of the STREAMS project, doing some pilots together, and particularly on our reflections about a supply chain tracing and mapping pilot that we partnered on. Patricia, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Great. Thanks, Erin. And hello, everybody. I'm Patricia Jurwitz, the CEO of Responsible Sourcing Network and creator of the Yes Due Diligence Initiative. Yes, yarn ethically and sustainably sourced. We joined Verite on this pilot in India. We had also participated in a pilot in Pakistan, both in the cotton sector. As many of you may know, I've been working on due diligence for at least 10 years now in both the conflict mineral space as well as cotton. And it's really great to have worked with Verite and different traceability technologies to see how traceability really can assist in implementing due diligence, especially in the mid tiers of supply chains, as well as how due diligence can strengthen traceability technologies. So really looking forward to sharing our results and experiences.
Great. So in terms of an agenda for today, we'll start with just a few words about our organizations, Verite and RSN Yes. And then I will share out a little bit of information about the Streams project to give you an overview of that project and all the different activities. And then we'll take you into this particular pilot of supply chain mapping and risk screening combined with Yes Due Diligence, and which we collaborated on with the supply chain mapping company SourceMap. And then we will look at the insights and reflections that came from that pilot. And then moving from pilot to action, looking at some resources that the Streams project produced coming off of the pilot, and looking from Patricia's side at how Yes has kind of integrated these insights and what is next for the Yes initiative. And we'll end things with a Q&A. And then throughout the webinar, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. And then we will kind of collate and respond to questions at the end of the presentation.
And I think it's actually the Q&A
Oh,
option there at the
sorry.
bottom of the
Yeah,
webinar, not the chat. I think the
thank
chat
you.
is not
Yeah,
open.
got
Okay,
it.
no
Yeah,
worries.
Q&A. All right, so as we begin, just a quick introduction to Verite. For those of you that are not already familiar with Verite, we are a US-based NGO with global operations. We have a mission to ensure safe, fair, and legal work for workers in global supply chains. We operate through a combination of work directly with major multinationals and their supply chain partners, as well as through independent grant or foundation-funded work. The Streams Project is an example of that independent grant-funded work. We engage with supply chain actors and stakeholders across various and many supply chains and geographies and contexts on all aspects of decent work. And that includes a very deep focus on forced labor and human trafficking. And Patricia, over to you to introduce Yes.
Great. So I had mentioned that Responsible Sourcing Network is the parent organization that created the YES initiative after a lot of research and work to address forced child and adult labor in Uzbekistan's cotton fields. And taking those lessons from that, as well as our work in conflict minerals, we developed this YES due diligence approach to train and then to assess and support yarn and fabric manufacturers, so the spinning mills and fabric mills, to understand due diligence and to implement it. In particular, we are focused on forced labor in the cotton industry. We're starting there, staying very focused. We could expand the risks and expand the materials in the future, but we really see that that's one of the most salient risks for this component of the industry right now. And what we're really bringing to how to benefit mills is that they'll receive training and support. They all appear on a public list. They're part of a collaborative community to implement due diligence. And for brands, it will assist brands in complying with various import and due diligence regulations. There is a members-only portal and access to data points, and it supports uniform due diligence. We know that it's very difficult for brands and others to be engaging their supply chain actors at tiers 2 and 3 and 4. And so that's really what we're looking to do. And we know you also lose traceability to country of origin at the spinning mill, where a lot of different fiber is blended together. And so that's another reason why we focus on that mill, that spinning mill aspect, that node of the supply chain. And being transparent with a public list of mills going through our program, but also really wanting to support mills with tools and other resources and a lot of e-learning. We've started in India and Pakistan. We're expanding to Vietnam this quarter, and Bangladesh is also on our radar for later this year. And you could see the list of our current members with Adidas, Amazon, Inditex. Levi's recently joined, also Disney, Verite, and Walmart, and the US Fashion Industry Association. So a lot more coming all about YES and our responsible sourcing network, but I'll hand it back to Erin.
Great. Thanks, Patricia. So with that, we can move into a little bit more information about the Streams project in particular, and then to the supply chain mapping and risk screening pilot. So the Streams project was a project funded by the US Department of Labor. It had the objective to leverage innovative traceability approaches that strengthen labor due diligence to identify and address forced and child labor. Our core implementing partners were Better Cotton and the Responsible Sourcing Network. And this project really was designed to be positioned at the intersection of traceability and due diligence, exploring how we can get from compliance-driven traceability to traceability with greater impact, especially in the labor arena. So we really, with this project, wanted to partner with practitioner organizations kind of working at that intersection and with the ability to really kind of cascade impact deep into supply chains. The project began in December 2020 and concluded in March 2025. It had originally been scheduled to extend through December of 2025, but was concluded early due to termination of all grant funding from the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs. We've been fortunate to be able to share some details about this project at other OECD side sessions in the past over the course of the project. So this will be our final share out on the project and what we produced and the insights that we gained. Streams accomplished its objectives through a set of core activities. We published a supply chain traceability matrix that I'll speak about in more detail later. This is a public resource on traceability and due diligence. We conducted a set of field pilots of traceability and due diligence methods and technologies in Indian cotton supply chains, together with Better Cotton and with RSN Yes. We more recently published a set of tools and resources based on the insights from the pilots. And then finally, we also conducted over the course of the project a set of events, virtual and in-person workshops and webinars like this one to share and discuss our findings and insights with the community. In this particular webinar, we're going to be looking at our field pilots and one pilot in particular. So Streams did pilot a number of traceability and due diligence methods and technologies with both Better Cotton and RSN Yes across various tiers of garment and apparel supply chains. This slide shows you the breadth of what was piloted, including digital chain of custody solutions and additive tracers with Better Cotton, and isotope testing and supply chain mapping and risk screening with RSN Yes. We are really grateful to all the traceability technology companies that we worked with on these pilots, as well as Better Cotton and RSN, and the many fabric and spinning mills, retailers and brands, and other supply chain partners that also participated with us and supported the pilots. Today, we want to focus on what we called the mid-tier gatekeeper set of pilot activities, which is indicated in the orange backward arrow. We partnered in these activities with RSN Yes, and we're going to look specifically at the supply chain mapping and risk screening pilot shown in the yellow circle. We were so pleased to be able to partner with RSN Yes on this mid-tier gatekeeper set of pilot activities because their standards, as Patricia was just saying, are built specifically for mid-tier supply chain actors and specifically for fabric and spinning mills in the garment and apparel supply chains. And this is a key choke point where cotton is often mixed, and tracking and tracing a physical cotton from a specific origin becomes very challenging. And so we really wanted to work directly with fabric and spinning mills in recognition that if you're screening for forced labor risk in cotton from specific origins, having that capability for screening built in directly at the mid-tier nodes is really critical and very powerful. And as Patricia was noting earlier, Yes, it really is striving to embed that capability directly with spinners and fabric mills to source cotton that's at a low risk of having been produced with forced labor in order to have these supply chain actors really be positioned as gatekeepers for forced labor, keeping cotton produced with forced labor out of supply chains. So with these pilots and with the digital supply chain mapping and risk screening pilot, we worked directly with fabric and spinning mills and had them doing a lot of the piloting themselves with their own management systems and with the support of Yes, and really seeking to emerge from the pilots with some very practical insights and recommendations for how to take this kind of work forward. Patricia, I'll invite you now to speak on kind of RSN Yes's perspective on why you were interested in doing these pilots and how you see this positioned with your work.
Sure. Thanks. And I know that it's typically a question about whether the slides will be shared. We will post them both on our RSN's website as well as I think Verite likely, and there will be a link to the recording of this webinar on the OECD side session site as well. So traceability tools have just grown by leaps and bounds in the last 10 years, as many of you probably have noticed. well, or maybe I should say 5 years, but regardless, it's been going very quickly. And what I think, there are different types of isotope and DNA analysis, kind of validating origins. And as a result, you can have a higher level of assurance. You're meeting requirements from regulators. The mills themselves, maybe their operations are minimally impacted, but it does assist with inventory and documentation procedures, as well as that mapping supplier management, with a focus really on both inputs and then, finished goods. So traceability brings this level of kind of more of a scientific way of looking at everything. Where due diligence, I think, builds more of a foundation of confidence, where it could build off of existing processes and systems. And a lot of those processes are actually okay. Maybe they just need to be tracked or communicated in a way that hasn't happened in the past. But having those, management systems that are really strong and effective is so important in due diligence. Looking at making sure that there's control systems through all of production. We know that a lot of mills do this already. They maybe just haven't, it hasn't been asked of them. But really paying attention then to where the mixing or commingling occurs and being able to document and communicate systems for managing that out to others is, where I think due diligence really plays a role. And then in both pre-screening and managing your suppliers, as well as managing your materials and bringing that whole concept of risk to both suppliers and materials, so that you can manage that risk and understand where it exists. Um, and then, really the focus of due diligence a lot is more on the actors rather than just the material itself. But I think bringing these two together with those additional levels of assurance, plus the stronger kind of management of everything, really plays a big makes a big difference and does make them stronger together, because you could have auditors checking on those systems, pointing out where they could be strengthened, because technology alone isn't necessarily going to be able to identify or manage those risks. And that's where I think due diligence can then complement the traceability tools.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. So with that framing, we'll move into the supply chain mapping and risk screening pilot. This pilot, as mentioned, for this pilot, we worked with the supply chain mapping and risk screening company SourceMap, using their technology to support specific steps in the YES due diligence process. Patricia will get into the process itself in a little bit of more detail in a minute. But just to say that this kind of supply chain mapping and risk screening technology is typically initiated by retailers and brands and at the retailer or brand node and cascaded upstream from there. In this case, we were exploring initiating the technology and the process directly at the fabric mill node and following the YES approach, taking a whole of supply chain look at the fabric mill. And so screening for risk across the entirety of the fabric mill's cotton sourcing footprint, instead of just looking at one specific order or product line. There were two main objectives. One was to develop and pilot a cotton inputs risk screen questionnaire using YES as the framework for the questionnaire and the analysis, and then utilizing SourceMap's supply chain mapping technology to map the fabric mill's supply chains and deliver and collect responses from the YES cotton inputs risk screen questionnaire, kind of across that supply sourcing footprint or supply chain footprint, to then support data analysis that would identify and prioritize sourcing risks and areas for enhanced due diligence kind of across the full sourcing footprint. We worked with a set of 4 fabric mills. Each was nominated by an apparel retailer or brand. And we are very deeply appreciative to the support of these four brands and retailers, as well as the U.S. Fashion Industry Association and the Retail Industry Leaders Association in conducting the pilot. And the pilot activities occurred from April 2024 to March 2025. So now we'll move to a little bit of a peek into this Yes Cotton Inputs Risk Screen questionnaire and how it was kind of constructed and the kind of risks that it was screening for. And I will hand things back over to Patricia for that.
Great, thanks, Erin. So the way Yes works is that as there's more risk or potential for harm identified, that more due diligence needs to be done with that higher risk. But looking first and supporting mills in just understanding who all their suppliers are, where all their cotton origins coming from. So all mills need to do that. Then you start to dig a little deeper to understand where are those supply chain risks. Now the risks could be with the materials, or they could be with the suppliers. They could be with the transit routes. And so understanding, okay, what does that look like? What happens if there's a risk found? So what if there's a question about some of those suppliers, or what if some of the documentation doesn't match up or goes through some strange port that it wouldn't make sense for that to happen. That's when you start to need to have strategies and kind of think about some of that in advance. And then you could actually assess the risk to be able to know if harm was found, so that harm could be then prevented, mitigated, remediated. And so here you could see where not every aspect of that work was covered under the streams pilot, but the first several aspects in really understanding who the suppliers are, who the sub-suppliers are, identifying risk, and then starting to assess for that risk. Next slide. So I've mentioned risk affiliated with materials as well as with suppliers. And in particular, we were looking at the origin. So basically, it's the country of origin where cotton is harvested. The supplier of yarn to a fabric mill may or may not be located in that same country of origin where the cotton is grown. We had some suppliers, yarn suppliers, who maybe were located in Vietnam or Bangladesh, where they grow next to no cotton, so they're importing all of it. So that's all of that has to be taken into consideration. But you really start with knowing who your suppliers are, that they're legal and legitimate, that they are actually have the right registration to do the operations that they are doing, but also what are the procurement practices of your suppliers, because this is a whole cascading due diligence approach where there's also then the expectations that your suppliers are also doing the right thing. So the questionnaire that Erin mentioned, that risk screen questionnaire, we developed a number of questions that address these two components. Next slide. So if you start digging into this a little bit more, and once you actually identify those risks, then you also want to prioritize engagement. And the prioritization of engagement occurs where there's more leverage, maybe a long-standing relationship, but also where there's the highest risk. And so dealing with those most salient risks first is an approach of the OECD. And so that's something that we also focused on. As Erin mentioned, we worked with SourceMap to share that questionnaire and have those fabric mills cascaded to their suppliers and their suppliers. And then came up with recommendations on how it could be used from those learnings for the overall industry. So we started with the supplier profile, and policies, looking at where those suppliers sourced their own cotton and whether the suppliers have any type of policy around decent work and responsible sourcing. Then we moved on to, or I had talked a bit about supplier and material due diligence, making sure those suppliers are legal and had the correct documentation. And then also looking at the origins of where the material is coming that those suppliers are sourcing. And then the last component of that is around their sourcing practices and their own transparency, and how are the suppliers reporting on their own sourcing and whether or not they're sourcing any inputs from unacceptable or higher risk entities or geographies. Erin, I can't remember if we go back to you on this one. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, so kind of taking that yes cotton inputs risk screen questionnaire, we then developed a supply chain mapping approach, partnering with SourceMap and using the yes questionnaire. So for the supply chain mapping activity, we, as I mentioned, partnered with SourceMap, which is SourceMap is a technology company that offers supply chain transparency solutions. SourceMap was interested to work with Verit and RSN and the fabric mills to see how well their technology and process could work when initiated in these mid-tiers, in order to gain some insight into maturity levels at the mid-tiers for tracing and tracking, and the approaches to supply chain mapping and transparency that might be most effective for initiating in these mid-tiers. And we were very grateful for their partnership in the pilot. So SourceMap used its typical cascading supply chain mapping approach, which, as mentioned, is usually initiated by the retailer or consumer goods company, but in this case was initiated at the fabric mill and cascaded upstream through a set of nominations and discovery phases. The aim for this pilot was to reach the Ginner node of the supply chain. And again, we were not mapping the supply chain for a specific brand or product line, but rather the entire cotton inputs supply footprint of the fabric mill. And we began to sort of prioritize that mapping process according to where risk was greatest, as I'll get into shortly. The pilot activities started with discovery and data collection, followed by a process of assessing and prioritizing cotton sourcing risk of the MAP suppliers according to the RSN Yes mid-tier due diligence standards. SourceMap also provided supply chain visualization, creating interactive maps and customized dashboards for each mill. And at the end of the pilot, we created recommendations and roadmaps for each of the fabric mills in terms of how to take the insight forward, and where we would recommend that they really focus their enhanced due diligence engagement for responsible cotton sourcing. There were some important limitations to the pilot, including that the data was self-reported, the mapping and risk screening data, and it was not independently verified. So the findings and insights were based only on the data received. As we'll get into, we did feel that nonetheless, the data did generate helpful and useful insight for risk prioritization, and an important next step in this process would be to layer in some independent verification mechanisms for the data that's being collected. This pilot used a due diligence-informed risk-based mapping and cascading discovery process, which is illustrated here in this graphic. We started with the entire cotton inputs supply footprint for the fabric mill, and then used the results of the Yes Cotton Inputs Risk Screen at the first direct tier of sourcing by the fabric mill to prioritize from among the mill's direct suppliers in order to identify specific segments of that mill's supply footprint for further mapping and due diligence based purely on risk. So the pilot was able to provide fabric mills with a set of particular kind of supply chain segments and areas where cotton sourcing was deemed likely to be the riskiest. And this provided a kind of a structured way for mills to assess their sourcing and to assess where it would make the most sense to apply that enhanced due diligence and follow-up, especially when we're talking about mills that have pretty large cotton sourcing footprints and really need to be able to do that kind of prioritization process. And as mentioned, coming off of the pilot and the prioritization, we also provided mills with a set of recommendations for how to follow up with suppliers to gain more information about how the cotton is being sourced and screened, and an additional verification and potentially remediation measures. All right, so that gives you an overview of the pilot itself, and now we'll move into insights and reflections.
I think, yeah, Erin, I think you're going to start and I'll come
Yes,
next.
that's right.
Okay.
And can you see the slide, Patricia? Is it coming through? Great.
Yep, both of them, both columns.
Excellent. Okay.
Yep.
Yes, so I will start by sharing some of the insights that are really related to the actual activity itself, and the interactions with our fabric mill partners and their supply chain partners. And then Patricia will share kind of broader insights and reflections on the exercise and kind of how to take those insights forward. So as mentioned, we worked with 4 fabric mills, and kind of throughout the pilot and in wrapping the pilot up, we really worked with them both on the pilot activities and in generating some insights around how the pilot was going and the kind of insights and data that it was able to generate for them. And really thinking about how to build over time more capability for this kind of tracing and responsible sourcing due diligence in these areas, mid-tier areas of the supply chain. So we've separated the insights into those for direct suppliers to the fabric mill. So that would be primarily spinners and yard traders, and then indirect suppliers to the fabric mill. So that could be cotton traders and ginners, and in some cases, even additional spinners. So we're really looking kind of at degrees of separation from the fabric mill itself in terms of thinking about the pilot insights. So for the direct suppliers to the fabric mill, there were generally low levels of familiarity with due diligence for responsible cotton sourcing and for this kind of whole of supply chain mapping approach, as opposed to just mapping and tracing for a particular product line or order. So this was the case for both the fabric mills themselves and also for their direct suppliers. With that said, we did have a very high completion rate and participation rate for both the mapping and discovery and the risk screening questionnaire activities at this direct supplier level. And this was really primarily due to the efforts of the fabric mills themselves in working directly with their yarn suppliers to introduce the exercise, to create that buy-in, and then to help support them in completing the exercise. So it really was somewhat of a labor-intensive process in terms of onboarding suppliers, explaining the purpose of the exercise, and really positioning them to be able to understand why it was being done and support them in completing it. With that said, the effort we felt really did pay off, in that we found that the questionnaire really was able to yield useful information at this tier, at the kind of that direct supplier tier, that enabled differentiation, risk differentiation in terms of where to look further and where to apply those resources to do that enhanced due diligence, and kind of productively segment the risk for the fabric mill deeper into its supply chains. And the primary way that we were doing that at this stage was really around sourcing location and the presence of any kind of management systems for due diligence and responsible sourcing. There were quite diverse ownership and procurement approaches for cotton among these 4 fabric mills that we worked with. And we found that where there was centralized procurement of cotton, that this offered a higher degree of leverage with direct suppliers and therefore kind of more robust participation. The use of traders was associated with a little bit more of a challenge and less visibility, though of course traders are very prominent, and I think this is just a question of kind of probably the need for further kind of socialization and onboarding of an exercise like this than we were able to have during the pilot. There was very high levels or significant levels of international sourcing across the 4 mills, and there was a lot of supplier overlap, which we found interesting at that direct supplier level. When it came to indirect suppliers at the lower tiers, there was a lower completion rate, which is not surprising, of both the mapping and the questionnaire, the completion of the questionnaire. And this was really due to the fact that oftentimes, as is well known, these direct suppliers often had weak leverage within their own supply chains. And so the indirect suppliers were more likely to exhibit kind of a lower willingness or ability to complete the exercise. So this required, again, more time to really establish the trust and the buy-in. But we were reasonably successful with that. And the risk screen questionnaires, again, were really able to be used to kind of target specific areas of the supply chain to invest that time and effort in. And as Patricia said, really following this due diligence approach, really we're creating a kind of an infrastructure that then could be used beyond the life of the pilot to really engage and continue with this work of looking at sourcing practices and risk reduction. So we found that really another thing that was quite helpful with that indirect supplier level was the value of coordinated approaches. So where we did have overlap at that direct supplier level, we found that was quite useful in kind of scaling efforts and communication about the pilot. And this really to us pointed to the value of coordinated approaches in the supply chain. So the more that can be arranged, the more it kind of helps reduce workload for everyone and creates better kind of buy-in and willingness to participate. At the end of the pilot, we provided all the fabric mills with a roadmap and set of recommendations, as I mentioned earlier, for how to kind of continue working on due diligence with their supply chain partners and how to continue to do these kinds of risk exercises to sort of continue to evaluate where they're applying their resources, where they're looking most deeply into their supply chains, and then within that work, where to kind of focus the remediation and the continuous improvement with their suppliers. We really found through this exercise that we felt having that due diligence framework built into the traceability exercise really helped kind of focus the exercise and really helped kind of in that approaching traceability from that due diligence perspective with labor impact, really able to kind of position the fabric mills themselves to be able to take the work forward into the future in a proactive way, and to take this opportunity of conducting a traceability exercise as an opportunity to also be really capacitating themselves on broader due diligence and on strengthening their management systems to be able to be good gatekeepers into the future. So with that, I will hand it over to Patricia to do that kind of broader reflection on the pilot.
Great, thank you. So we really saw, Erin pointed out a number of advantages on the previous slide, but bringing that type of risk screen early into the supply chain, I know that there has been a lot of looking at risk, on your own business operations. Maybe looking at tier 1, but really getting that, kind of cascading it and pushing it, as far up the supply chain as you can. Eventually, we'll be able to meet up with some of those farm level due diligence initiatives, so just farm level initiatives, and kind of link everything up. I think it's, we're really trying to strengthen, I would say, that those nodes in the middle that really haven't been as engaged in the past, and they really haven't been engaged in their sourcing. They maybe have been looking at their own water usage or energy usage, There's also been conversations around their own, the labor conditions inside some of those spinning mills, but nobody's really talked to them as much about how they're sourcing their product and if they're looking at risks in regards to sourcing their product. So I think that really makes a big difference. And then having, this whole supply chain due diligence approach, which it's been great. I'm here at the OECD right now. Had an earlier conversation with other peers in the industry, namely with like Textile Exchange and Better Cotton, who are also using the same OECD due diligence framework now to really address their work, which is more kind of based at farm level. And so I think having everyone talking with that same language is really useful because there are still many, many people in the industry who've never heard of due diligence and really don't understand what the expectations are, or they think it's still a social or environmental compliance approach, and it's not. It's different. So really kind of bringing that forward to talk about how this is different. And the other thing that I think a lot of the spinners appreciated, or the mills, is that we look at all the cotton that they're sourcing, not just the preferred cotton. So many initiatives are more preferred oriented, but really understanding that there's a lot of risk in conventional material as well. So it did strengthen visibility, I think, across, looking at all those different cotton inputs, and especially I would say cotton inputs where it might be a noil or, the shorter fibers, which could be blended together at from coming from a different spinning mill. So a spinning mill sourcing from a spinning mill, looking at those different types of situations. And as Erin was talking and mentioned, that a risk screen questionnaire is an effective tool to really bring that risk-based due diligence to the spinning level. And so one of our recommendations, maybe I jumped to the bottom there, but is to have a universal risk screen kind of template that folks could fill out and not have to fill out lots of different types of questionnaires and risk screens. We have seen this happen in the minerals supply chain, for example, and it's been really successful. So it is something that I'm kind of keen on seeing if that's something the industry will want to adapt in the future. But also, knowing that to make all this happen, we need retailer and brand demand. That we had a couple of brands nominate the mills who were in this program, which was great. We have had that experience where they just want to share with us the material for that particular brand, and we have to explain that we're looking at everything they're sourcing, not just for any particular customer. And that data, verification is a critical element to all of this. A lot of it, you start with the self-reporting, but then figure out how you can corroborate that information, whether that's the supplier or whether that's the material. But I think the more we talk about this, the more we'll have this opportunity to check on that data. And that coordinating our efforts, as I mentioned before, is definitely important. And I was even talking to folks about that today as well, with capacity building being consistent, and that there's opportunities to collaborate about that. And so investment is needed, I would say, at all levels, both to kind of support implementing these industry-wide type of initiatives, but also understanding where the real risk is and making sure that we have credible information coming out so that that we could prioritize and educate mills on prioritizing engaging in those areas first. I think there's another slide. Oh yeah, the spinner reflection. So we have to, unfortunately, we had a cancellation of one of the spinners that was going to give their thoughts about working with the pilot and also going through yes assessments. But they were able to provide some information emailed to me, and so a couple of the challenges really that even before I think we go on to this slide, maybe Erin, if you go back, yeah, is just some of the real challenges is that some of these spinning mills, I think Erin mentioned, some are really big, and that one, they had said that they have, 25,000 transactions a year, and so how do you really keep track of all of that? And a lot of it is from their own suppliers, meaning their own internal suppliers. So in particular, we've seen some pretty complex vertically integrated mills where they're making their own fabric, and then they have multiple subsidiaries where they are making their own yarn. So they're sourcing their own yarn. And so I think part of the challenge for them is, and that they've communicated, um, how are they assessing or implementing due diligence on their own subsidiaries, right? And we did start to break this down further to look at where were they sourcing cotton domestically and where were they importing it, so that we could explain to them that when they were importing it, that opens up additional risk, especially if they're importing it from countries that are deemed to have higher risk of forced labor and child labor and other, decent work challenges than from lower risk countries such as Australia, for example. And so but then again, the question is, how do you actually address risk in those other countries that are so far away and maybe a trader is involved with that purchasing? Which is another reason why having kind of all industry-wide approach is important, because any one spinner, just like any one brand, is not going to be able to have the impact on addressing the harm happening at farm level unless everybody is really working together. Um, Let me just double check. One other thing is um, the central procurement challenge was another point that was brought out. Is if I know Erin mentioned that you have more leverage doing procurement centrally, you do have to make sure your procurement staff or managers are on board with this whole pilot. That was something that we noticed, that even if the CSR, or sustainability staff person, it has committed to it, unless their purchasing folks are actually part of it too, it's not going to work, because they're the ones with the relationships and the contacts at the suppliers, the yarn suppliers in this case. And if they don't want to provide that information, then you don't have anyone to send the questionnaire to. And so making sure both that procurement team is on board, but then also if it's being centralized, and even for us coming at it from a yes perspective, where we have the facilities are assessed, if there's multiple facilities that are all having procurement from one place, you want to make sure that that procurement team is part of the overall assessment too, because that's really where they're managing risk with those suppliers. So I think those were the main kind of comments. I don't know, Erin, if you had anything else that you wanted to offer from that mill perspective.
Well, I think you covered the territory really well, Patricia. Um, and I think just we're kind of at an inflection point here with the presentation. Just to note also, we do have some really great questions coming in. And so I'm thinking we should probably try to wrap up in the next
Yep,
3 or 4 minutes so we can start looking at those questions. So with
sure.
that, I mean, I think you've spoken to this value of the coordinated industry-wide approach. And
Yep, but I
just to,
do want to do a
yeah,
little plug for that
yeah,
short story about the compliance
yes,
labyrinth that came from one
yes,
of our
yes,
partners at
yes.
a spinning mill, because she's dealing with all the pressures of providing more data, and a lot of it does come down to relationships. But yes, if anyone's interested in a coordinated kind of questionnaire approach, please contact me separately.
All right, so kind of taking this from the pilot to action and different kinds of takeaways. On the Verite side of things, we really, through the Streams project, we're primarily focusing on producing resources that could be available to the community, the traceability and due diligence communities kind of broadly and well into the future. So I will just take a couple of minutes here to profile and preview some resources for you that were produced by the Streams project. So we did produce something called the Traceability Matrix. It's a major part of the Streams project. It's a website that features different kinds of information on how to design traceability approaches that have labor due diligence outcomes in mind. And it has a lot of examples of traceability in action and looks at a lot of different major commodities and the types of labor considerations that might impact your traceability decisions. So encourage you to have a look at the traceability matrix, and there's a QR code that down there in the bottom right. In addition, we also have the Streams resource suite. This suite of resources is where we really started to share out our insights, specifically on the pilots. It has advice on how to design and deploy traceability mechanisms, again, in ways that yield actionable insight, really taking the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct as the core framework. So starting to kind of translate those insights into HRDD frameworks. We have a set of three different main types of resources. One set of general resources on traceability and labor due diligence processes, some guidance for using supply chain mapping and global trade data to identify labor risks in supply chains, and then finally a set of issue briefs that share out our insights from our pilots on specific types of traceability technologies, including digital chain of custody platforms, additive product tracers, isotope testing, and supply chain mapping and risk screening. And these issue briefs really look at how these technologies can be used to support labor due diligence, how they can be used in ways that are accessible for a broad range of supply chain actors, and how the technologies can be used in a way that's beneficial for upstream producers and suppliers. So I encourage you to have a look at those resources. They're practical and actionable. And we'd be very keen to hear your reactions and feedback. And so, Patricia, over to you to share out a little bit on YES.
Yes, I think I said we'll share these slides. So looking at the deliverables that YES is providing for visibility, influence, and compliance, I mentioned our public mill list, different data points in regards to mills implementing a due diligence approach, looking at all cotton that comes into a facility, and really being able to collaborate then on that engagement. And e-learning and tools to support suppliers, you could go on to the next slide, is really where we're focusing because we want these mills to be successful. So we've started doing assessments, moving beyond pilots, and having those e-learning. Right now, e-learning course is available to those going through the YES program. We might make it just available to the public going out into the future because we really want to get this information out as much as possible. I talked about the countries that we're going to be furthering, our efforts out to Vietnam and Bangladesh later this year, and continue with engagement and assessment in India and Pakistan. The other thing that we're going to be focused on this year is offering some data points, how we integrate those into various dashboards for both brands as well as other initiatives that are tracking supplier data points. And moving beyond just the foundational YES assessments to addressing risk as well, which is you would be then fully conformant. I mentioned this is the website where we have our publicly available mill list. We'll continue to expand that as more mills come on board. Next slide. And as they develop their own policies and procedures or their due diligence reports, those links will be on that website. All those mills are listed. We already saw some of the brand members and these are the audit firms, and we're managing our assessments through Sumera. Next slide. I think we're almost done. There we go.
Yeah, we are.
Great.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes, and I'm not sure, Erin, if you can see those questions, but we could um, start addressing them. I think the
Yeah.
first one, yeah, um, really has to do with mitigation measures, how those were implemented regarding forced labor and child labor. And I'd say that this pilot is really focused more on um, starting to identify risk with suppliers, not yet getting all the way to the field level, which is really where we want to get and where I see a lot of that type of prevention and mitigation happening is with partners on the ground who are doing that, such as Better Cotton or Fair Labor Association, um, and others who are looking at that aspect. I don't know,
Yeah.
Erin, if you have anything that you want to add to that.
Yeah, exactly. I would just add that, right, what we're trying to accomplish with this pilot was really, as we were saying before, kind of doing that risk segmentation approach. So really coaching and mentoring and capacitating fabric mills to apply that kind of risk screening approach across their supply footprint and then sourcing footprint, and then identifying areas where they want to be really digging in more deeply and gathering more information about potential harms and impacts, and then getting to that mitigation. So really, we didn't get to mitigation yet. We never intended to with this pilot, but with the recommendations that we have provided to mills, we gave some roadmap options. And as Patricia said, kind of next steps would be to partner with organizations that really do have that on the ground presence that can work with cotton suppliers to be addressing problematic conditions where they exist, and also to be providing those evidences and verification of good or ethical practice as well.
And I think the other aspect is, there is some expectation, focusing on some of the strongest relationships first, is where spinning mills have relationships with gins. For example, this is going to be more the case in a cotton producing country such as India or Pakistan. But, being able to provide those mills resources so that they could do training with the gins on addressing and identifying, where forced labor, child labor exists, and then what to do about it. And I know Verite has also been, great at developing tools and resources along those lines as possible. And next question is how much brands need to be involved in leading the whole process, if there need to be regular visits to the direct suppliers, explaining what due diligence, why it's needed. Do they commit on better pricing or long-term agreements? Erin, do you want to take a first stab at that? Or you want me to?
Sure. I mean, I would say, and I think Patricia, you'll have some interesting observations on this as well, but I think where brands are actively involved, you're going to see greater impact more quickly. Um, Are they necessary in all cases? I wouldn't say so. I mean, we actually worked with some branded fabric producers that themselves are quite proactive in taking on some of this due diligence and really looking at their own management systems independently of working with any particular brand. And so I think there actually is quite a lot that can be done working directly with producers and suppliers. And at the same time, absolutely, brands are such a critical and important piece of this. And the more they are engaged, and the more, as is said, they can commit to really long-term relationships with their suppliers, the more quickly you're going to see impact and kind of progress.
Yeah, we only have a minute left. So the last question, and maybe you just want to pull up our contact info there, Erin, in case
Yeah.
folks want to get a hold of us. But it's from Aziz Raymond from iMentor. So he's
Mm.
excited to see traceability and due diligence going hand in hand, wondering how open the supply chain actors are in being visible to the large set of brands and retailers who may not be part of RSN to leverage one-time work to avoid duplication. And I would say that nobody wants to duplicate efforts. I mean, we don't want to, and I'm glad to hear as well other initiatives don't want to. And I think it is important for us to make this information, publicly available, the training, or at least if somebody just wants to attend a course and not have to go through the whole assessment. I do think assessment, it's really focused on identifying gaps in your systems. So it's to strengthen your own systems. And I think then you can go to your clients and kind of talk about how your systems are strong to be identifying and managing your own risks as mills. And I think we will see more and more mills you know, as we continue to build those involved, folks will hear from multiple entities that this is important, that it's not just a one-off brand here or there who wants this work to be done. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. And thank you, Erin, for co-hosting.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you too, Patricia. And thanks everybody for coming. We hope this has been an interesting and engaging session for you. We would welcome your feedback. We've got our emails there and some QR codes for how to learn more about our organizations. And wishing you a great day.
Great. Hope to
Thanks,
see some
everyone.
of you here in Paris.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.